Hi, welcome to Davis Phoenix Coalition Office Hours. What is Office Hours? It's a new project we're trying that is short video explainers about common questions that the community has, or resources for a more inclusive classroom, or any kind of questions that you may have about being inclusive or understanding marginalized communities, or anything that helps prevent hate crimes and promotes understanding and embracing our difference in Yolo County, which is what we do. So welcome, and if you have a question that you would like to see addressed during office hours, please reach out to the Davis Phoenix Coalition. You can send us an email and put the words office hours in the subject line. So let's get started. So today we'll be talking about trans identity and the process of transitioning. We know there's a lot of questions about trans identity and what the whole process is of how people, especially kids, transition. And there's a lot of myths and a lot of disinformation. So we really want to clear this stuff up and hopefully give you a good explainer and answer a lot of questions that you may have had. So the first topic that we're going to cover is, what is the difference between sex and gender? So first of all, sex. It's assigned at birth. So when a baby is born, usually the baby is XX and has female genitalia, or that baby is XY and has male genitalia. But what a lot of people don't know is there's actually more than two sexes in humans, because 1 out of every 100 births is a person who is intersex. Someone who's intersex may be genetically different. So they may have genetics that are neither XX nor XY, but some kind of variation. Or they may have genitals that don't fit clearly between male or female, and it may not ever develop into clearly male or female genitalia. And it's up to that person as to how they want to identify when they get older. So the first thing to know is that there's actually more than two sexes in humans. And 1 out of 100 births is not a huge anomaly. It means that it's part of natural human development. So gender, on the other hand, is a social construction. So what does that mean? Well, it's basically something that we made up, and it's something that we agree upon as a society. So while a social construction sounds like something that's not real, there's actually a lot of social constructions in our society that are very real and have very real effects on people's lives. The first one is race. So there's no genetic difference that establishes whether somebody is a certain race or not. That is actually just a construction that has happened over many centuries, where we have determined who is Black, who is Latine, who is Asian American, who is white, and who is Native. And that is a mix of how people look, where they come from, what their cultural background is. But again, there's no genetic foundation for the difference of race. It's a social construction, but it has very real effects in people's lives. Marriage is a social construction, but when you do your taxes, you know that marriage has very real effects. Money is a social construction. You can say that money is just pieces of paper, but if I say I have 5 pieces of paper in my wallet, that doesn't tell you what's really going on. I could have $5 in my wallet. I could have $100 in my wallet. I could have 5 receipts that don't have any value at all. So money, it doesn't have a real value because it's a piece of paper, except money really drives our world. So it has very real effects. The next point I want to make is that being transgender is not new. There's a lot of talk about how being trans is trendy right now, but it's not a new phenomenon. If you look at human history across the globe, there are many cultures that have had more than two genders. They've had three or even more. In fact, being trans is neither a white nor a Western phenomenon. Many pre-colonial cultures actually had three or more genders before colonialism. But due to Christianity being the dominant culture in white Western societies, colonialism brought the construction of two binary genders. India is a really good example of this. India has had three genders for centuries, which is why India actually had a non-binary category long before we made that an option in the United States. So while trans identity is becoming more known and becoming more visible in the United States, it's not a new phenomenon at all. Next, we're going to get into the logistics of how people transition, especially kids. There's a lot of disinformation and myths out there about how transition happens, about like giving hormones to kids before they've even gone through puberty or removing sex organs, which definitely does not happen. So, early transition, say from 0 to puberty. First of all, kids can come out as trans as early as 2.5 and 3. How is that possible? A lot of people talk about their kids thinking that they're dogs at that age. And they're like, well, my kid thought that they were a locomotive when they were 2 or 3. How can they know what gender they are? It's actually really developmentally appropriate for kids to be figuring out what their gender is at ages 2.5, 3, 3.5, and 4. That is an age when kids are starting to understand what gender is in our society. What makes a boy? What makes a girl? What do boys like? What do girls like? And then they're thinking, how do I fit in to this idea of boy and girl? And in a lot of cases, kids are finding out, well, I don't identify as either, or I identify as something in between, or I identify as the opposite gender as my sex assigned at birth. So there's a big difference between kids pretending that they're dogs or locomotives versus kids figuring out where they fit in this whole idea of boy or girl, or whether they fit in there at all. So when we're talking about transition at these early ages before puberty, the only difference of social transition is name, pronouns, and possibly gender marker. And that's it. There's no surgeries, there's no hormonal interventions. It's just the kid getting a haircut that matches their gender identity and starting to dress in the clothes that they feel comfortable in, and maybe using a name that they feel better fits their own gender. So there's no big permanent changes at all. In fact, social transition is a really good way for kids to try on that identity and see if it's something that actually fits for them. So what is the next step? Well, the next step begins when puberty begins. And puberty can be a time that is really upsetting and can be very destabilizing for trans kids, especially if they go through a puberty that doesn't match their gender identity. So the first thing that happens is hormone blockers. And hormone blockers, all they do is buy your kid time. It arrests the process of puberty and just prevents it from starting. And that gives a kid time to watch their peers go through puberty, really understand the process, watch the body changes of their peers, and start to think about what kind of adult body do I want to have based on what my peers are going through. So hormone blockers are frequently used for cisgender kids to stop precocious puberty. And precocious puberty is something that's happening more often these days, and scientists don't really know why. So in fact, cisgender kids are using hormone blockers more often now. For trans, it's a gift of time. And the important thing to know is that there's no permanent changes. Hormone blockers simply put a pause on puberty. When you come off of hormone blockers, puberty progresses as if nothing ever happened. If a kid decides that they want to go through the puberty of their sex assigned at birth, they can go off hormone blockers. They will go through puberty, and no one would ever be able to tell that they'd ever been on blockers. So, if a kid decides that they want to go through a different puberty than their sex assigned at birth, that's when HRT, hormone replacement therapy, would start. And typically this is going to start in later teens. And what we try to do is make sure that kids don't feel awkward still having a pre-pubertal body when their peers have already gone through puberty. And so the timing is to let those kids lag behind a little to watch their peers go through it, but then hopefully not wait too long so that the kid feels really awkward and very apparent in the fact that they haven't gone through puberty yet. So if HRT sounds familiar, it's because a lot of women and other people with uteruses who go through menopause do HRT. So it's not a new or experimental process at all. For trans kids, it's a process of gender affirmation. It helps them go through the puberty that they feel is congruent with their identity. The thing about HRT too is that while it will produce changes in a kid's body, even those changes, some of them, some of them aren't necessarily permanent. So, for example, if a kid who is assigned male at birth ends up going through HRT and has some breast development, softer skin, doesn't develop an Adam's apple, things like that, if that child changes their mind, then they can go off HRT, and when that puberty assigned at birth starts going, those changes will, that kid will start looking more and more male. And while there may be certain changes that linger, like breast tissue, those are things that are easily amended later. And so if a kid changes their mind, they can still be a cis boy later. And again, it'll be hard for people to tell. So we're talking about a lot of processes of going step by step with doctors and mental health care professionals in order to get to this place at all. Okay, now we get into the part that a lot of people find weird and scary, which is surgery. The first thing to know is that minors can't get surgery without parental consent. So any kind of surgery that a kid is going to have, if that kid's still a minor, then it's going to be something that they do with the knowledge and the consent of their parent. Obviously, once kids are adults, they're 18, they make decisions about their own bodies, and they can decide whether or not to have surgery. The other thing to know is that surgery is not something that happens all at once. It's not like you go in for surgery and then you come out a fully trans individual. Surgery is also something that happens step by step. And in a lot of cases, there's no one process of surgery where it's like, this is where you start, and it's not finished until you've ended here. There's a lot of choices that people can make about how much surgery they want to do. And some trans folks will opt not to have surgery at all, or indeed any kind of medical or surgical intervention. For example, Alok Ved Menon is a non-binary person, and they have decided not to do hormonal therapy and not to have surgery. They have the body that they would have had if they were cisgender, but through makeup and wearing the fashion that makes them feel comfortable, they are expressing their gender identity without having used any medical interventions. And that's always an option. Trans folks have no obligation to pass as real men or real women. That may not be their goal. And so how they decide to present themselves, what kind of medical interventions they want, if any, that's going to be the individual choice of that trans person. And if your kid has a trans identity, nothing says that they absolutely positively must go through this process. They can pick and choose or decide not to do any of this at all. It's all valid. All right, so in most cases, the first type of surgery that people will opt for, if they choose to go that path, is top surgery. And so for trans women, they may opt to have breasts. For trans men, they may opt to get chest surgery to remove their breasts. Obviously, chest enhancement and reduction are things that cis women go through all the time. In fact, the rates of breast enhancement for minor girls is far, far more common than affirming chest surgery for trans children. So if people are worried about kids getting surgeries that are going to permanently change their bodies and being too young to make that decision, well, they should probably look at breast augmentation first. Now, the next possibility is bottom surgery in order to get the genitals that match that person's gender identity. That is a much longer process. In addition, for example, for trans men, there's nothing that says that they have to get their ovaries and uterus removed. That's not a necessary step. In fact, a lot of trans men will keep their uteruses and their ovaries, and some of them have been able to get pregnant and nurse their own children. So it really depends. Trans men may opt to get rid of their uterus and ovaries later in life because they're having the same kind of perimenopausal uncomfortableness that a lot of us have. And additionally, having periods can be really difficult for gender dysphoria, which is the feeling that your gender and your body are not lining up, and it makes you really uncomfortable. And so in some cases where, for example, low-level birth control is not able to completely get rid of all those periods, or HRT doesn't completely get rid of periods, then trans men may opt to get rid of their uterus and ovaries in order to just stop menstruation in a really permanent way. But again, it's going to depend on what's happening medically with that person's body, and they'll do it in consultation with the doctor. And again, there's nothing that says that bottom surgery is required or mandatory, and not all trans people are going to decide to get it. So, as I was pointing out before, having medical or surgical interventions doesn't necessarily mean that that person's fertility is gone forever. So that's a more detailed discussion than makes sense to get into in this short video. But if you have questions about it, there's good resources about how you can preserve fertility or allow your kid to have fertility options in the future. So just being trans doesn't mean that you will never get grandchildren if that's your kid. But again, like, I don't get a say in whether my kids have grandchildren or not. It's the kid's own decision. And that's why this whole process is very child-led, because it's that kid's own body, it's that kid's own identity, and the only person who's really an expert in what that kid wants and what kind of future that kid wants is the kid themselves. So thank you for tuning in to our very first Davis Phoenix Coalition office hours. I hope you found this informative and enjoyable. Again, if you would like to send us a question to be addressed in office hours, you can go to our website, www.davisphoenixco.org and hit the contact button and you can send us your question. Just make sure that you specify that it's for office hours. For any kids or teens that have questions, we would love to hear from you and we would love to help you out in a future office hours. You can ask about resources or any questions you have about inclusion or even something basic like social skills during the COVID-19 pandemic and after shelter in place. So please join us next week for our next office hours and thank you so much.